You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW, in Whitewater, Wisconsin. You're listening to RASHKIN Report. You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM, The Edge in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is Yuri Rashkin, and you're listening to RASHKIN Report. And I'm excited to welcome back to the program Slava Rabinovich, news and financial analyst based in Moscow, Russia, is joining us via Skype. Slava, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Yuri. Thank you for having me back. Looking
at the situation in Russia, and it seems like it is getting, and of course, we're used to hearing word Russia now in the context of our elections and Donald Trump, and we'll get to that, all of that in a second. But first, situation in Russia itself, as far as civil society, appears to be maybe not quite as bad as Turkey, but is certainly crumbling with the recent arrest of a prominent theater director, Kirill Serebrennikov, who was, just a huge star in artistic scene, and now he is so far appears to be under house arrest, but he could be looking at real jail terms. What are your thoughts about all of these developments and where Russia is headed these days?
Well, Yuri, as I said before, and I will repeat again, Russia has turned into a full-blown fascist state of the modern 21st century version of Mussolini or the likes. It's difficult, of course, to compare it like for like with the Mussolini regime, but I guess that it's probably the closest that you can compare it with. And the peculiarity of and severity and the danger of this situation is that it's not only Mussolini, a political personality, like politician who came to power and became a dictator and with a fascist ideology. This is somewhat different. This is a fascist ideology and a dictatorship coming not from a politician, but coming from mafia, which actually took control of all levers of power, turning the whole state into a fascist mafia state. Another comparison is probably to think about it as a somewhat a mix between a fascist dictatorship of Mussolini combined with the, let's say, mafia of the U.S., Chicago, and the likes of 1930s, taking power in the United States and installing their own president, their own vice president, their own members of Congress, and their own attorney general, and so on. So that's probably as close as you can get in the description of what happened in Russia. And on top of that, this mixture of fascist dictatorship and mafia taking charge of the state. On top of that, they also took controls of the second in the world largest nuclear arsenal. This is what Russia is about. And the recent detention and arrest of the world-renowned theater and movie director is just another step on the path that is overridden by this formula of mafia fascist dictatorship with nuclear weapons.
Slava, I have to ask you, when you use word fascist quite a bit, and can you explain what meaning do you put into that? What is a fascist state to you?
It is an illegal, legalistic, oppressive dictatorship that produces and churns out, is churning out a set of illegal, unconstitutional laws that become actually laws of this state, under which those people who took the power can intimidate, prosecute, and actually eliminate people who are not in agreement with it. It is also a marriage between the so-called state and the business, which must suck up to the dictator and the entire dictatorship. It is anti-human, anti-constitutional, anti-human rights, anti-everything. In fact, anybody who would read up on how the fascism in Italy developed under Mussolini will understand what I actually mean. But as I said before, it's not the closest equivalent of that. It is worse than that, because on top of that you have mafia taking over everything, and also possessing nuclear weapons, and so you have this probably a really unique in the history of mankind situation. It is the most dangerous thing that the entire world is actually facing, and many people do not realize that. And I am very concerned that so many people do not realize what's actually going on.
Slava, let me ask you then, when you look at the situation of, as I mentioned earlier, worsening violations of, I guess whatever is left of civil society, with all the branches of government not working, but the repressions continue to seem to be escalating, and situation, I think, by most people's accounts, is getting worse, whether it's politically or economically or socially. It's getting more restrictive. How much of that is due, do you feel, by the actions or inactions of United States, both with the State Department that has more of a kind of lights out approach, and the sanctions on the other hand that are supposedly squeezing the regime?
Well, as the State Department, along with CIA and other branches of power and organizations in the U.S., as much as they could not predict the fall of the Soviet Union and were at a complete loss about what has happened then, I believe they are running with in the same state of illusion of what's going on in Russia right now, and they are not taking it seriously, unfortunately. When we're talking about sanctions, for example, everybody understands, everybody who are not prone to the Russian propaganda, but rather looks at it objectively, everybody understands why these sanctions were instituted, what they are designed to achieve, and so on. But I believe that the set of sanctions is not enough, and sometimes it's actually misguided and misleading in terms of their goals and aims. I believe that late Boris Nemtsov, who was gunned down on the 27th of February of 2015, right near the Kremlin, my friend and my actually apartment neighbor he was for much more so-called personal sanctions, sanctions against those individuals who violate human rights, who violate international agreements, who violate the territorial sovereignty of neighboring states, those who commit domestic and international crimes in terms of theft, money laundering, murdering people like Sergei Magnitsky, and so on and so forth. So, yes, there is a so-called Magnitsky Act in the U.S., but I believe that this Magnitsky Act and similar laws should have been adopted, and more people in Russia should have been put on this personal sanctions lists, including, by the way, all of the top managers of all state-owned Russian media companies. These are not journalists. They are not journalists at all. These are people who are engaged in propaganda and spreading hate and lies. And if they were sanctioned, that would have given them a strong message that this type of behavior in the Russian mass media will not go unnoticed by the international community and will not go unpunished. So I think that the U.S. in particular and G7 and other countries in general could have done much, much more in terms of sanctions over the last 3 years.
Slava, then, what are your thoughts on the connection between, the Mueller investigation, I guess, would be the simplest way to say it. Do you feel that this is justified, or do you feel that it is not a likely scenario that, that Trump may have had connections with Russia based on your financial experience?
Well, it would be extremely difficult to judge for me and for people like myself what would be the difference and where is the line between what's legal, what is illegal in terms of the dealings of Mr. Trump before and after he became the president, especially before. I mean, he was not a governor of any state or a senator or a congressman or a mayor. If we were talking about, for example, Michael Bloomberg as a potential presidential candidate who would have won primaries and then won presidency and became the president, his company, Bloomberg LLP, is present in Russia in the entire financial sector, but nobody can say that Bloomberg himself, Michael Bloomberg, is somebody who had some dealings in any shape or form with any kind of potential, people from the Putin's administration, from the state, from the Russian state, with somebody with so-called oligarchs who are close to Putin and so on and so forth. His Bloomberg terminals are in every single financial institution across Russia, in Moscow and St. Petersburg and Novosibirsk and in other major cities, in banks and other financial institutions. With Trump is much more difficult because he was a real estate mogul who traveled the world and had dealings in many countries, including many countries in emerging markets, including those countries where the so-called normal course of business is actually not allowed for U.S. citizens. Pursuant to the U.S. Foreign Corruption Act, and therefore you have to look into whether these dealings of Mr. Trump in Russia before he became president were legal or illegal. Even if they were legal from the U.S. standpoint, whether these dealings being legal forced him into some kind of obligations, financial or moral, or just, by way of giving a word, or by ways of friendship, or by ways of some other sorts of obligations, whether his hands were tied by this or not. And then what was happening when he was already elected but not inaugurated yet, and what kind of obligations, if any, he has after he was sworn into the office. This, of course, is up to the investigators in the U.S. to dissect and then present to the Congress and the Senate and to the probably to the likes of even Attorney General if need be. But U.S. of course has entered into a very interesting zone due to the prehistory of this president, and as it looks on the surface, I believe that there are people on actually understand what has been happening, what is happening now, and it's back way back in January, on the 15th of January, before Trump was actually inaugurated. I wrote my text on Facebook, which became very popular. This post was reposted many times. I predicted that it is with a huge probability one can actually say that the next president of the United States could be Mike Pence, on the premise that Trump may not be able to sit through the end of his first term. And I based my not a prediction, but rather, a possibility of this happening on the fact that the reality and the perception is sometimes different. But once a perception takes over, then it may not cause the real effect of XYZ, but it may cause some events, ABC, which may cause XYZ. In other words, how it works. Let's say that Trump has done nothing illegal. Let's say that none of anybody of his team has done anything illegal. But all of a sudden, there is this wall of allegations that there is this partly humorous and hashtag in the U.S. which is called "The Russians Did It," which reads "The Russians Did It." And once you have this hashtag "The Russians Did It," you have people right, left, and center saying, "Oh, really? Probably the Russians did it." And then the next thing that you know, that people from the pre-election team and from the president administration team once he took office, they've been called to the hearings on Capitol Hill, and the more they are called, the more people are there for hearings, the more there is a probability of them lying about something under oath. And so the hashtag the Russians did it itself may not be the cause. It may be somewhat of a accelerator to something. But even if it's not the cause, then you have a number of people with a higher probability of being called for to testify, therefore higher probability for them lying, and then a higher probability for them being prosecuted for their lying under oath. And as we know, the situation with Clinton was not about what color of the dress Monica Lewinsky had. It had everything to do with lies under oath. So therefore, this, back in the middle of January, I wrote this post about that you just go about probabilities of this hashtag the Russians did it, unleashing this chain of events, which will, in the end, will cause some people or a number of people to lie under oath. And what happens next?
So would you say that, according to our president, winning is everything and losing is the worst thing that can happen? Do you feel that Russia is winning right now?
Well, I would separate, of course, Russia and Putin and Putin's regime. But I believe that on one hand, Putin and his regime, of course, lost. It's only on one hand. I will explain what on the other hand. It's lost because by throwing public support behind one particular candidate and then breaking into U.S. computer systems in a way that everybody knows and being accused of all of that, it created the situation where Trump, even in his desire to become friends with Putin and improve relations with Russia and say, hell with the Ukraine and let's divide up the world as it was divided in Yalta in mid 1940s. He was running in this corridor, and this corridor was completely narrowing. It was becoming more and more and more narrow because Putin and his people did what they did. If they actually did not do anything about U.S. elections and Trump would have won, then nobody in the U.S. would have been able to accuse Trump that he has some obligations to pay back Putin and therefore he has to relax sanctions or eliminate them completely and blah, blah, blah. But otherwise, there is a perception that he has to pay back. And once there is this perception, he cannot possibly pay back because otherwise he would be impeached. And therefore, that's why I'm saying that the corridor where Trump is running towards Russia is actually becoming narrower and narrower with each of his steps. That's how Putin's regime lost. How Putin's regime won is because Putin has designed his activities in geopolitics in such a way where money and bribing and deception and these kind of things, they actually make miracles among many people, including acting and existing heads of state, including such people as former Chancellor of Germany, Schroeder. And so that's on one hand. On the other hand, the more the entire world is in flux, the better Putin's regime operates, because the world in flux does not have enough time and resources to do anything about problems in Russia, for example, in terms of, human rights violations, in terms of actually recognizing or not recognizing the elections, the Russian elections into the Russian parliament, the so-called parliament, the presidential elections. If the world is in flux, it doesn't have time, resources, knowledge about these things. And the situation where the U.S. is in flux, it's probably the most important for Putin, because U.S. probably has the most weight in the whole picture for Putin and his gang. And if the U.S. is engaged in their own dealings with Trump, Congress, Attorney General, possibly process of impeachment, and as a minimum, investigations in the Trump's Russian dealings, all of this creates chaos and puts the U.S. in flux, either somewhat or could be to a much greater extent. That is part of a good thing that could happen to the Putin's regime in terms of what they can do when the U.S. is not watching. So I say both. Putin's regime won on one hand and lost on the other.
Slava, going forward, considering what's going on, and Russia obviously wants to respond in some way, but they mostly are successful at punishing their own residents and citizens, as well as promulgating some kind of nefarious schemes, whether it's cyber hacking or, I guess, buying up politicians and sponsoring extremist politicians, as well as having wars with its neighbors, hybrid wars or whatever you want to call them. Going forward, do you see the situation continuing as kind of more of the same, or do you think that the regime pushed in the corner can do something more drastic? And what could that be?
Well, I just don't know, Yuri. The problem is that once I could have predicted the direction and the magnitude of the fall in the price of oil in 2014, based on what I knew back then, and also predicted the ruble exchange rate in the short to medium term, which actually halved in value. Now I cannot really predict what would happen with the regime, when and how. And this is because Putin and his bandits, they dismantled the state, and they also dismantled 5 key elements of the state. 3 of them are 3 independent branches of power. He dismantled not only the independence, but he dismantled the entire branches of power. We don't have a court system. The judicial system is in ruins. We don't have parliament, because this is not a real parliament. We even don't have the president as an institute of presidency, because he is not really a president in that sense. He also dismantled the institution of free, fair, and democratic elections. He dismantled the peaceful, democratic change of power as an institution. And because of these 5 major institutions are all gone. We can only we can only say that the regime will fall when there will be some kind of a combination of the so-called black swan events. But the whole nature of black swan theory is that nobody knows where, how, in which direction, and what would be the gist of it. And so, therefore, we cannot predict. So Putin dismantled all the institutions that would have enabled us to predict anything. And he made everything possible for the combination of black swan type of events to destroy everything. And therefore, the prediction power is close to zero, and the how it's going to happen is actually based on the combination of black swan, swan type of events, which by definition is unpredictable. That's the whole both beauty in a sense and awful situation on the other hand, and obviously it translates into a no zone, a toxic place for every single investor in the world, because one cannot predict what kind of return you can get, what kind of risk you must take for this return, what would be the time horizon, and what could be the exit strategy. All of this is completely gone. So,
but that's more about the internals of the system, and it's it's gloomy. But what do you feel are the likely actions of the system going out? Can it do anything, or are you saying that all the variables on the inside are crushing it and limiting its ability to do damage on the outside?
Well, on the outside, it's really interesting what kind of research now we have, including the U.S. sources. It is estimated that the Russian so-called elite, I hate to use this word because this is not actually an elite in a society of, less than 1% of kleptocrats. So I hate to call them the elite. But in any case, even if you use this word, the combined wealth of the Russian elite, which is less than 1% of Russia, keeps about 65, 67 trillion rubles in ruble equivalent, of course in a non-ruble currency, offshore out of Russia. So it's about $1 trillion. And this is about 3 times the Russian gold reserves. This is not only gold, I mean hot currency and gold reserves. This is about 100% or actually more than Russian GDP. So one can actually say in like even a funny form that you had your own elite. I mean, if you say on behalf of the US, for example, right? Or on behalf of the combined the West, or if you can say on behalf of the entire world, if you combine it with offshore jurisdictions, you can say you had your own elite at some point. Now your elite is actually ours. We privatized your elite. They have $1 trillion with us, not with you, Russia, with us. So therefore, this elite, again, I hate to use this word, with $1 trillion owned by the so-called elite outside of Russia, what do you think, Yuri, they will want to do to the rest of the world where they keep their money?
They'll probably want to be nice to it.
Well, to say the least, and it makes even less possible for Putin to do any stupid things. But on the other hand, Putin is stuck in his place because he knows once he is no longer president that he obviously, he is not fighting for power or the money anymore. He is fighting for his freedom and his life. And it will be impossible to drive him out of power while he's alive. He'll be clinching to this so-called presidency until the last breath before he is dead. That's for sure. I see no other way. And that actually makes him go against this so-called elite, and the elite going against him at some point. In fact, I know for sure 100% that the not the vast majority, but probably all of these people, they want to turn the clock back and do, to do away with what has happened over the last 3+ years and go back straight from 2017 in 2013, pre-Ukraine, pre-annexation of Crimea, pre-sanctions, to continue to steal in Russia and put the stolen goods, cash, and assets outside of Russia. That's what they want to do. And I don't know how this conflict will play out, but there are just too many people and too much of the wealth, which is actually not earned but stolen, which actually play a huge factor in this possible rift between this so-called elite and Putin and his, probably 5 closest cronies that have as much to lose as Putin himself in terms of life and freedom. But other thousands and thousands of families that created their lives around their mansions in south of France, Italy, Miami, and so on. These people, they desperately want to turn back time and go into 2013 and get into a status quo of at least 2013. So I don't know what's going to happen with this situation. And again, this will be resolved probably with the help of some sort of combination of black swan type of events.
Slava Rabinovich joining us. Actually, I should have been more accurate. From deep in the forest of Karelia towards Finland over there with amazing internet connection. Slava, anything you'd want to mention in conclusion? This is it's very interesting. So let's see if we can keep up with the black swans and keep the track of them. But anything else you'd want to say in conclusion?
Well, in conclusion, your radio listeners should write a letter to their congressman and to their senator and actually say, we are concerned about what's happening in Russia in terms of the crimes that are committed by the Putin's regime in areas of Russian constitution and violations of it, in terms of human rights, in terms of our own interests as U.S. citizens because U.S. interests lie with free and democratic and friendly Russia as a possessor of the second after the U.S. Arsenal of nuclear weapons. We want more sanctions rather than less, but we want these sanctions to be addressed not against the Russian people, but rather against those individuals in the Putin's regime that are responsible for all these crimes. Well, I've been a U.S. citizen. Once wrote a letter to my senator in the state of New York about something, and I got a response. And after that, something what I was writing about has actually happened. So maybe this would be my very, very small playing a small part in what you and your listeners could do from your end.
Absolutely. Slava, thank you so much. I think that being active citizens and being involved, that's, I always say you don't have to do politics, politics will still do you. So it's important to be involved and express your opinion, whatever it is. Slava, thank you so much for joining us once again, and all the best.
Thank you very much, Yuri.
You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW, in Whitewater, Wisconsin. You're listening to RASHKIN Report.